My daughter-in-law didn't even look up from her phone when I called out that my wife had fallen. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the fall itself. Not the sound my wife made when she hit the floor in the kitchen, that hollow, awful sound that I will never in my life unhear. Not the way she looked up at me from the linoleum with this expression that was more embarrassed than frightened, like she was apologizing for the inconvenience of being 79 years old and suddenly unable to get up. No. What I keep coming back to is my daughter-in-law sitting on the couch in our living room, scrolling and not looking up. My name is not important. What I am is a husband of 53 years, a father of one son, and a grandfather of two boys who call me Pop Pop and think I hung the moon. I'm 67 years old. I worked 31 years in commercial roofing, which means my knees sound like a bowl of Rice Krispies every morning, and I've earned the right to speak plainly. So that's what I'm going to do. My wife's name is June. She has silver hair she keeps short, a laugh that fills whatever room she's in, and hands that have made more pies, changed more bandages, and held more crying grandchildren than I could ever count. She has a bad hip from a fall 4 years ago, and a heart condition she manages with medication and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. She is the center of my world. She has been since I was 22 years old, and she walked into a 4th of July barbecue in Dayton, Ohio, wearing a yellow dress and arguing with her cousin about the designated hitter rule. I loved her before I even knew her name. So when I heard that sound from the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in March, I moved faster than a man with Rice Krispies knees has any business moving. She had slipped on a wet spot near the sink. She hadn't hit her head. Thank God. Thank God. But her left ankle was already swelling, and she couldn't put weight on it, and her coloring wasn't right. That's the thing about loving someone for 53 years. You learn their colors, and June's color in that moment was not right. I got down on the floor with her, told her not to move, told her I was going to get help. My son Marcus and his wife, I'll call her Renata because that's her name, had been staying with us for the week. They were having some work done on their house over in Centerville, a kitchen renovation that had already run 2 weeks over schedule. And June had offered them the guest room because that's the kind of woman she is. That's the kind of woman she has always been. She would give you the guest room and change the sheets herself and leave a little dish of mince on the pillow, and she wouldn't think twice about it. They'd been with us 4 days at that point. I called out from the kitchen, "Renata, I need some help in here." Nothing. I called louder, "Renata." And then I heard her voice from the living room, unhurried, slightly annoyed. "What? June fell. I need you to come in here." A pause, the sound of the TV. Then, "Is she okay? I don't know yet. Can you please come in here?" Another pause. Longer this time. She came in eventually. Stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, looked at June on the floor, looked at me kneeling beside her and said, "Should I call Marcus? He's at the hardware store." I said, "Call 911. She said, "Do you really think it's that serious?" I looked up at her. I don't know what my face was doing. I know what I felt, which was a kind of cold, focused fury that I had never felt before in my life and hoped to never feel again. I said, "My wife is on the floor and cannot stand up. Yes, I think it's that serious." She made the call. I'll give her that. She stood in the doorway and made the call, and when the dispatcher asked questions, she handed the phone to me because she didn't know June's medications or her doctor's name or her medical history. She had been living in our house for 4 days. The paramedics came in 11 minutes. I rode in the ambulance with June. Renata did not offer to follow us to the hospital. She said she would let Marcus know, and that she hoped everything would be fine. I sat in the back of that ambulance and held my wife's hand and watched her face for signs of pain and did not think about Renata at all. There was no room for it. There was only June. St. Elizabeth's emergency department on a Tuesday afternoon in March is a particular kind of purgatory. Fluorescent lights that make everyone look vaguely unwell. Chairs bolted to the floor in rows, upholstered in a gray that might once have been blue. A television mounted too high on the wall, playing a cable news channel, with the volume just loud enough to be irritating and not loud enough to make out actual words. The smell of antiseptic and cafeteria food from somewhere down the hall. I sat in those chairs for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I had my phone. I called my son. Marcus had already gotten Renata's message and was on his way. I called June's cardiologist answering service and left a message explaining what had happened. I called our neighbor Phyllis, who is June's oldest friend, and who cried a little on the phone and made me promise to call her the minute I knew something. I did not call Renata. She did not call me. I got coffee from a machine near the vending area. It cost $2.25 and tasted like hot brown water with ambitions. I drank it standing up because I couldn't sit still, walking a slow loop from the vending machines to the window to the nurse's station and back, checking the doors every time they opened. Marcus arrived about 40 minutes in, still in his work jacket, sawdust on his boots. He came through those automatic doors fast, scanning the room until he found me, and something in my chest loosened a little when I saw his face. That's your kid. That's still your kid, no matter how old they get or how old you get. He came and sat next to me and didn't say much for a while, which is exactly what I needed, because he's always known when to talk and when to just be there. We had raised him right. I want to say that clearly. We had raised him right. He asked how it happened. I told him. He asked if she'd been conscious the whole time. I said yes. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, which was a lie, but it was the kind of lie you tell because the honest answer is too large to speak out loud in a hospital waiting room. He didn't ask where Renata was. I noticed that. The doctor came out after about an hour and 40 minutes. June had a sprained ankle. Badly sprained. She'd need a boot and crutches for at least 6 weeks. And her blood pressure had been elevated, which they were monitoring, but her heart was stable and she hadn't lost consciousness and there was no head injury. They were going to keep her for observation overnight, standard protocol given her cardiac history. She was going to be okay. I closed my eyes for a moment when he said that. Just a moment. Just long enough. Marcus put his hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything, and I was grateful for that too. We were allowed back to see her about 20 minutes later. She was propped up in a hospital bed, looking annoyed at the blood pressure cuff on her arm, and asked me immediately whether I'd eaten anything. I told her I'd had coffee. She said that didn't count. I told her she was lying in an emergency room bed, and maybe she could ease up on managing me for 10 minutes. She said, 32 years of habit, I'm not stopping now. Marcus laughed. I laughed. June smiled and her color was coming back, and everything was going to be all right. Renata came to the hospital at 7:30 that evening. By that time, June had been moved to a regular room on the 3rd floor, and Marcus and I had taken turns sitting with her and going down to the cafeteria to eat something that technically qualified as a meal. The overnight bag I'd packed for June was sitting on the chair in the corner. Her sister had called, and they'd talked for 20 minutes. The nurses knew her name, and she'd already charmed 2 of them. Renata came in carrying a coffee from the Starbucks drive-thru 2 blocks from the hospital. 1 coffee. For herself. She stood at the foot of June's bed and said, "You gave us quite a scare." June looked at her pleasantly and said, "I scared myself too." Renata made conversation for about 15 minutes, asked about the ankle, commented that the room was small, mentioned that the kitchen renovation was going to cost more than they'd budgeted. Then she touched Marcus on the arm and said, "We should probably get back. The boys have school tomorrow, our grandsons. Our grandsons have school tomorrow, yes." They were with Renata's mother, which I knew. They were fine. They had been fine all day. Marcus looked at me. I shook my head slightly. "Go, it's fine, I'm staying." He nodded. He kissed his mother on the forehead and told her he loved her and squeezed my arm on his way out. Renata said goodnight to June. She said goodnight to me too as an afterthought from the doorway. The door closed. June looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "She never asked how you were doing." I said, "I noticed that." June said when I called out, "Was she there?" I said she was in the living room. June said, And she looked at the ceiling again and she didn't say anything else about it because that's June. She doesn't belabor things. She observes them and files them away and she doesn't forget. I stayed until 10 o'clock. The nurse on the overnight shift was a big, cheerful man named Thomas who told me with absolute certainty that she was in good hands and that I needed to go home and sleep. I went home and did not sleep exactly, but I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence where June's breathing usually was, and somewhere around 2 in the morning I made a decision that had been forming in my chest all day like ice. Her name is not on our will. Let me be clear about what I mean by that, because I know what people will assume. I don't mean I had her removed out of spite. I mean she was never there in the way she perhaps expected to be. June and I worked with our attorney 12 years ago to set up our estate. We were thorough about it. We are not wealthy people. I worked in commercial roofing, not finance. But we own our house outright, we have retirement accounts, and we have a piece of property in eastern Tennessee that belonged to June's parents that has been in her family since 1958. The estate goes to Marcus, to the Grandchildren's Educational Trust, and to a handful of organizations June cares about deeply, including the local food bank where she has volunteered every Thanksgiving for 19 years. What I mean when I say Renata's name is not on our will is that she is not a beneficiary in her own right. Everything flows through Marcus as is standard. But June and I had always had a general understanding, unwritten, unspoken but real, that if something happened to both of us, we would want Marcus to have the latitude to use the estate in whatever way best served his family, including his wife. That understanding changed, for me, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when the woman sitting in my living room looked at my wife on the kitchen floor and asked, "Do you really think it's that serious?" I called our attorney the next morning. His name is Gerald. No, wait, that name is on the list. His name is Kenneth Ashford, and he has been handling our affairs for 15 years. I told him what happened, not to complain, just the facts. And then I told him I wanted to revisit the letter of intent attached to our estate documents. The informal guidance letter we'd written that outlined our wishes for how Marcus should use his inheritance and what we hoped he'd consider when making decisions. I wanted that letter to be more specific. Kenneth asked a few questions. I answered them. He said he could have revised documents ready for my review within the week. I thanked him, and I hung up the phone, and I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, and I looked at the wet spot on the floor near the sink where I had placed a rug the morning after June came home from the hospital, which was Thursday, and I thought about 53 years. June came home on Thursday morning. Marcus picked her up. I had asked him to, because my truck is higher off the ground and more difficult for someone on crutches, and his sedan would be easier. He brought her home and helped her inside and settled her on the couch with her foot up, and the boys had sent a handmade card from school that Marcus had taped to the wall where she could see it, and she cried a little when she saw it, which she will deny if you ask her. Renata was not with him. Marcus said she had a work call she couldn't reschedule. June said that was fine. I said nothing. The three of us spent the afternoon the way we used to spend Saturday afternoons when Marcus was a teenager and the world was simpler. June on the couch, Marcus in the armchair, me in the kitchen, making a pot of soup from the chicken I'd defrosted the day before. The television on low, the boys' card on the wall, the smell of garlic and celery filling the house. We did not talk about the hospital. We did not talk about Renata. We talked about the boys and about Marcus's project at work and about the Tennessee property and whether we should do anything about the old barn that has been slowly subsiding since 2019. It was a good afternoon. That evening, after Marcus left, June and I sat together on the couch with the TV on, and she put her feet in my lap the way she has for 40 years, and I rubbed her ankles, carefully given the boot, and she said, out of nowhere, "I want you to know that I know." I said, "Know what?" She said, "That you were scared, that you held it together because you always hold it together, and I want you to know that I saw it and I know," I said. "I'm okay," she said. "I know you are. I'm just saying I know." She looked at me. "And I want you to take care of yourself. Not just me. Yourself." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She smiled and looked back at the TV and said, "You better." I don't know exactly when Renata found out about the changes to the letter of intent. I suspect it was about 3 weeks after June came home because that's when things shifted. Marcus called me more than usual. He seemed distracted when we talked. He came by once to help me with something in the backyard and left quickly without coming inside to see his mother, which was unlike him. And then one evening, a Sunday, Renata called me directly. This was unusual. In the 18 years she and Marcus had been together, I could count on both hands the number of times she had called me directly. For things like holiday plans, logistics, questions about whether we were coming to the boys' school events, never for conversations. We did not have that kind of relationship, and I had long since made my peace with that. She called me at 6:15 on a Sunday evening. I saw her name on the screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered. She said hello. I said hello. She said, "I understand there have been some changes to your estate plan." I said, "June and I meet with our attorney periodically to keep things current. That's just good practice." She said, "Kenneth Ashford reached out to Marcus as." I said he would. "Marcus is the primary beneficiary." She said, "And the guidance letter." I said, "Yes." A pause. Longer than the one in the kitchen doorway. She was choosing her words, I could tell. She was deciding something. She said, "I feel like this is a reaction to what happened in March, and I think that's not fair." I said, "What happened in March?" She said, "With June. With the fall. I know you were upset. I said I wasn't upset. I was concerned for my wife. She said, "You're punishing me." And I want to be careful here, because I am 67 years old, and I was raised to speak to people with respect, even when, especially when, the conversation is difficult. I took a breath. I thought about June on the kitchen floor. I thought about the doorway. I thought about one coffee from Starbucks. I said, "I'm not punishing you. I'm adjusting a document to reflect what I've learned about my family." She said, "That's the same thing." I said, "It isn't. Punishment is something you do to change behavior. This isn't about your behavior. This is about my understanding." She said, "Your understanding of what?" I said, "Of who shows up." Silence. I said, "Renata, I'm not going to argue with you about this. The will itself is unchanged. Marcus will inherit what he would always have inherited. What changed is a letter, a private letter, about our hopes and intentions, and I stand behind it." She said, "Marcus is upset." I said, "Marcus can call me." She said, "This is going to cause problems." I said, "I hope it doesn't." She said, "It will." I said, "Then we'll deal with them." She hung up. I set the phone on the kitchen table and sat there for a moment. The soup was on the stove. June was in the other room, watching her show. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, someone a few houses down was mowing their lawn even though it was nearly dark, which is the kind of thing that drives June crazy, and that I find oddly comforting. Normal sounds, the sounds of a life that was still intact. I stirred the soup and called June for dinner. Marcus came by 3 days later, alone again, without the boys, without Renata. He came in the evening and I had coffee going because I knew he was coming and I know my son. He sat at the kitchen table and wrapped his hands around a mug, and he looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 3 weeks, and I felt for him. I genuinely felt for him, because he was caught in the middle of something that was not his fault and not his doing, and that he did not ask for. He said, "She's really upset, Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "She feels like you've written her off." I said, "I've made adjustments to a private letter. Nothing that affects what she or you will inherit." He said, "It's not about the money." I looked at him. He looked away first. "Okay," he said. "Maybe it's a little about the money." I said, "Son, let me ask you something. When you got to the hospital that day and found me in the waiting room, how long had I been there?" He thought about it. "Almost 2 hours, you said." I said, "I was there 2 hours and 20 minutes before you arrived. In that time, did Renata call to check on your mother? Did she call to check on me?" He was quiet. I said, "I'm not asking you to answer that to prove a point. I'm asking because I want you to think about it." He said, "She had things to do." I said, "I know she did." He said, "She's not close to Mom. You know that. They've never been close." I said, "I know that too, and I have never required her to feel something she doesn't feel. But Marcus, your mother was on the floor. She was on the floor, and then she was in an ambulance, and then she was in a hospital bed overnight, and I was alone for most of that. Not because you weren't there. You were there as fast as you could be. But I want you to think, as a husband, if your wife were in an emergency room, where would you want to be?" He put his hands around his coffee cup and didn't say anything for a long time. I said, "I'm not trying to make you choose sides. I'm not trying to cause trouble in your marriage. That is the last thing I want. But I am 67 years old and your mother is 79, and we are at an age where things happen. And when things happen, I need to know, I need to have it documented somewhere in writing, who in this family shows up." He looked at me. His eyes were wet and he was trying not to let them be, which is something I recognize because he got that from me. He said, "I show up." I said, "I know you do. I know. And that's reflected in our documents, son. That's reflected in everything." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did I. And eventually June called from the other room asking if Marcus was staying for dinner. And he called back that he was, and that was that. He stayed for 2 hours. He helped me with the dishes. He sat with June and watched half of her show and asked questions about the storyline with the sincerity of a man who does not watch the show but wants to understand why his mother loves it. He kissed her on the cheek when he left and told her to call him if she needed anything, and she said she would, and he meant it and she knew he meant it. At the door he stopped. He said, "I'm going to talk to her." I said, "That's between you two." He said, "I know. I'm going to talk to her." I said, "Okay." He said, "I love you, Dad." I said, "I love you too. Drive safe." I don't know what was said in that conversation. It wasn't mine to know. What I know is that 2 weeks later, Renata showed up at our house on a Saturday morning. Not for any particular reason, she stated. She came with Marcus and the boys, which they had started doing again. on the last 2 Saturdays, after a brief period where the visit seemed to find reasons not to happen. But this time she didn't park herself in the living room with her phone. She came into the kitchen and asked June if she could help with anything. June looked at her. June said, "You can peel those potatoes if you want." Renata said, "Okay." She washed her hands and she picked up the peeler and she started peeling potatoes. And June told her about the recipe, and they didn't say anything significant or dramatic or resolving. They just stood in the kitchen together and made potato salad. I watched from the doorway for a moment. Then I went out back to where Marcus and the boys were kicking a soccer ball around in the yard. And I played with my grandsons in the afternoon sun until my knees told me it was time to stop. And I sat on the porch steps and watched them run and thought about 53 years of a life built with someone who chose you back. There is no dramatic ending to this story. My wife healed. She was off the crutches in 7 weeks, which was ahead of schedule, and her cardiologist was pleased with her numbers at the follow-up, and she went back to volunteering at the food bank before the doctor technically cleared her, which I pretended not to notice. The letter of intent stays as it is. I have no plans to change it. Renata and I are not close, and I don't think we ever will be. But she came into the kitchen that Saturday, and she picked up the peeler, and that means something. I'm old enough to know that people don't change all at once or all the way. They change in increments, in small gestures, in choosing one Saturday morning to put down the phone. It's not everything, but it's not nothing either. June made the potato salad. Everyone ate it. My youngest grandson declared it the best potato salad in the world, which is objectively correct, and June laughed that laugh that fills every room it's in. That sound, that's the one I want to keep.